Okay, I'm very pleased to be part of this whole series. Vera and Maxim have put together an observatory on the BRICS, and as you just said, we've already had two excellent seminars. I hope we can match up to that level. I'm also very pleased because I've just recently, from the beginning of September, become visiting lead fellow at the Higher School of Economics, which is, of course, hosting this observatory and which is hosting this seminar series. And I was in Moscow just at the end of October, where I met some of your colleagues, Stephanie, who were also present at the Higher Education International Seminar, the annual event that the HSC Institute of Education organizes. Anyway, I'm going to be doing it obviously with, as Stephanie said, with Pradeep, my good young friend from JNU, my former university. So that's the title, Indian TVET, Between Informality and Ambition. Um, and let's start. So here we are. This is the structure of the presentation. We'll begin very briefly with a theoretical framework, which is based on the work of Nobel Prize-winning economist Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson, and the 2024 Economics Prize, the Nobel Prize in Economics, where they argue that development processes are greatly influenced by institutions, and I'll be speaking a great deal about institutions here. Then we'll talk about the 5 pillars of the Indian TVET system and their adequacy to meet the quantitative challenge. The quantitative challenge is huge on account of the serious historical neglect, which we will have opportunity to discuss. Then I'll talk about the quality issues in India's TVET, and then turn it over to Pradeep, who will talk about the labor market and self-employment, and then finally close in one slide talking about the policy implications, especially in the field of finance for TVET through industry involvement, a subject that I've said a few things in previous seminars, and I'll come back to my favorite theme. Because the Indian TVET system doesn't engage or the industry has not engaged in the Indian TVET system as much as it needs to. So let me start. Now, look at this rather dense table carefully. It presents a sort of historical picture over the last 40 years, 45 years, in fact, from 1983 to now, of the distribution of the current workforce, of the then workforce in 83 and 93 and 10 years later and 2012, and then most recently 2023. And it shows the level of education and training and the share of the workforce, which is, so notice that at the bottom we've got 100. So obviously for each year, you've got a distribution of the workforce based on what proportion is, if you look at the first column, is illiterate or only has primary education, meaning classes 1 to 5, up to middle means up to grade 8. Secondary essentially means grades 9 and 10. Higher secondary means 11 and 12. And then you have graduate and above, meaning 3 years of undergraduate degree or above. And you can see that we demonstrate all the qualities of a low middle income country. And in this respect, we have to be contrasted with the other BRICS. All the other BRICS are upper middle income countries. And what you can see from here is I'll ask you to focus essentially on this last column. Look for my cursor. I'm pointing the cursor to 2023. And you can see nearly a quarter of the workforce, tragically, is still illiterate. I mean, this is ridiculous. But we started about sort of, let's say, 30 years ago at half the workforce being illiterate. That's really tragic. It shows how poorly, for 40 years after independence, higher education tended to be um, prioritized at the expense of school education, and we paid the price of that. You can see this now. I'm not going to spend any more time on this, and you've already got a sense of this, and I'll come back to this as to uh, why we are where we are. And this is why this situation. So this is where I think the theoretical framework that Asimoglu and Johnson, which is founded on institutions and their importance, comes into play. How? Well, in the following way. Our education system, as it evolved post-independence in 1947, is in some ways a reflection of our society. But before I begin to talk about our society, I think we should note that the colonizer, and please note that unlike China, we were actually fully colonized. You know, China was not fully colonized uh, ever. Yes, it suffered a century of humiliation from the mid 19th century to the mid 20th century, but it was not quite the same as being completely and fully colonized. This is particularly tragic for a country which had contributed until as late as 1820s, until 1750, a quarter of the global GDP. Like China, a quarter of the global GDP came from India, as it did in 1600 and in 1750 as well. And by 1820, you know, some 70 years of British rule, that contribution itself had fallen to 16%. And then by the time the British left, after plundering the country in every which way, and I speak with some confidence on the basis of economic history, that the foundations for the Industrial Revolution in the UK were laid on the backs of Indian workers and on the backs of the exploitation and the surplus extraction that took place from the colonies generally, but particularly from the jewel in the crown, which was India. So the point is, we inherited a literacy rate of 18%, uh, life expectancy of 32 in 1950. Now, this we inherited. We also inherited a social structure which was extremely inequitable, a social structure which belongs to, unfortunately, the majority religion. In other words, the caste system cannot be separated from the social structure that the Hindu religion actually fostered. And the result of that is the following. Very simple. I'm sort of going to fast forward from this point onwards. That we're still very much a Brahmanical society. And because we are a Brahmanical society, now if you're interested in what that means, I'm going to answer questions in the Q&A. I don't really have the time to sort of go into that. But a Brahmanical society gave rise to a Brahmanical education system, a very unequal education system, where what we did in the first 30 to 40 years of our after independence, after planned development began and the whole process of industrialization began, is the following. We invested significantly in higher education. People like me were products of that. And we neglected school education, TVET included, a subject that I'll come back to in a second. In fact, the American political scientist Myron Weiner in 1990 wrote a classic book which talks about, tries to understand how it is that even in 1990, the literacy rate in India is still 51%. Child labor is widespread. So if you have such high levels of illiteracy, in other words, when the economic reforms began in 1991, while China had already achieved, when its economic reforms began in 1979, China had already achieved literacy rates of something like 70 to 75%. We were still at 51% in 1990. Now, inevitably, people who come out from this level of education enter into an informal labor market. So our labor market is also highly segmented. There is a small informal sector, a small formal sector, and a vast informal sector. And the vast majority of those who come out with poor education enter the informal sector, a subject I'll come back to later, and Pradeep will develop it. So this segmented labor market actually reflects very much a segmented education system, which itself is a reflection of the social stratification that I've just been talking about. So in other words, the education system in many ways compounds the educational backwardness that came with the British Raj and that came with a Brahmanical education system. So on top of these historical issues, we have policy decisions. You see, the period of 1950 to 1980 saw in our economic development process of plan development. The first five-year plan began at the same time as China's first five-year plan began in 1951. A heavy focus on heavy industry and a total neglect, on heavy industry-based industrial import substituting industrialization, which implied a heavy focus on higher education and correspondingly a relative neglect of school education and along with it a total neglect of vocational education and training. There were costs, but there were benefits of this strategy. What were the results? Well, one cost, of course, is that barely as you saw in a previous graph, only 2% of the workforce had formal TVET in the year 2004. That number has grown, but it's not grown very much. Yet, the heavy emphasis on higher education meant that 700 companies in Silicon Valley today are Indian-owned. That means our best elite institutions were creating young people, generating bright young sort of engineers who all migrated. And even in the social sciences or any of the sciences, you look at any Ivy League university faculty in the United States, it's dominated by people of Indian origin. Not just Chinese, not just Korean, but heavily dominated. The majority of them are Indians. So benefits, yes, indeed, but a subject that I'll come back to later. But sorry, I needed to turn my clock on, my stopwatch on, so that I don't exceed my time. Stephanie, how long have I already spoken?
You have spoken for 17 minutes.
Hello?
Did you hear me?
Guys, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Santosh. Can you hear me?
My speaker is on. I can't hear you. Hello?
Santosh, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Veera.
But
yeah,
what's wrong with
No, I was just checking how long have I spoken?
About 17 minutes, Stephanie told us.
Okay, I better speed up. Okay, so essentially you've got the point. What we have here is in some ways a crisis situation. I'm going to move on in the interest of time. Okay. So what you get as a result of this kind of neglect of TVET is manufacturing and services workforce which is relatively poorly educated. Okay. Now this needs to be contrasted with the following fact, which is in my last bullet here, that in the last 35 years, and now I'm going to sort of focus obviously on the most recent period and no more of the history any longer. that the miracle economies of East Asia, they're characterized by one, an industrial policy, but also much better general academic levels, plus much higher TVET penetration in the workforce. That's how East Asia became the factory of the world. And that's how we have a situation where 3 of the 5 countries of the world which are at the forefront of Industry 4.0 are in East Asia: Japan, China, and Korea. So, and then the fact that we've got Industry 4.0, which is beginning to get utilized, obviously, at least in the automobile industry in India, challenges of artificial intelligence now risks converting our formal sector employment to rising unemployment. A subject that Pradeep will deal with later on. I'll also touch upon it. Now, just to touch upon this employment situation, we are a relatively young country. Some 2/3 of our population is below the age of 35, though it is in the last legs of its demographic dividend. The other 4 of the 5 BRICS, they're already over their demographic dividend. We still have a 15-year window remaining. However, young people who are now getting much better educated because the enrollment rates rose very rapidly across the school system after 1990. And as a result of that, the higher education enrollment rates also rose, a subject that I was speaking about in Moscow at the end of October at the Higher Education Conference. We have a situation of rising youth unemployment. Partly, of course, because the economy is not growing as fast as it was post-COVID, particularly, but also because there are structural issues in the economy which have resulted in slower pace of growth, and in a slow pace of economic growth, and accordingly slower number of jobs being in the non-farm sector being created. So in the dream run period from 2004 to 14, when our economy was growing at 8% per annum, we were generating 7.5 million new non-farm jobs per annum. And it's non-farm jobs that need to be obviously generated, because that's what the aspiration of the young, better educated is. But since the growth rate slowed after the policy mistakes of this government in the last 8 or 9 years, what we've seen is the growth rate has fallen and the absolute number of non-farm jobs being created has also fallen. And that's resulted in youth unemployment rates, which I'm trying to show here by education and training. And these are for different points of time. And the further right you go in this graphic, what you can see, I mean, the orange at the bottom of the graph may not be so clearly visible to you. Maybe it is if you look carefully. I'm asking you to look here, right? So you've got educational levels for the illiterate primary or middle, the middle educated, actually relatively low. But the moment and this is typically true for most developing countries, that those with higher levels of education have higher levels of unemployment rates. Open unemployment rates I'm talking about, not underemployment, a subject which I don't have the time to get into. The important point is that in the advanced industrialized countries, you have an opposite phenomenon, that the those with a poor education are the ones which have higher unemployment rates. No, in most LMICs and countries which have recently graduated into UMIC category, the youth unemployment rates tend to be sort of higher for those who have for lower education than for those who have higher education. In our case, look at the very high rates and the rates, how the rates went up. And this number is for graduates in the year 2017-18. It fell slightly, but it's still 29%. Youth here defined as 15 to 29. Just for your interest, even those with formal education, you have fairly high unemployment rates here. This is that graphic, okay? And those with technical training, technical education, meaning essentially those with post-higher secondary, certificates, diplomas, full degrees. You've got a phenomenon where it could be it shot up in 2017-18, even before COVID, to 37%. It has more recently actually declined. Anyway, so it's pretty grim situation for the vast majority of youth. Clearly, there are employability issues related to the quality of TVET. So it's not just the number of jobs that are being created, which I was talking about earlier, but there are employability issues. Okay. Now, this is showing you youth unemployment rates by level of technical and vocational training. And what you can see is a further detailing here of the unemployment rates for youth. This graph is for those with a technical degree, 2005 and 2022. Those with a diploma, those who have a diploma a below graduate. This is formal VET and informal VET. So pretty bad. Okay. Now, I'm going to sort of move more rapidly through. I think these points have already been made. So I'm going to move more rapidly through, other than making one point. What we have essentially is the education system creating, forgive me, education system creating very segmented outcomes. What do I mean by that? The broad human capital base is poor, but improving rapidly. The base is also improving rapidly. However, there is, of course, the elite technical education and generally elite higher education generally, which are world class. What is the outcome of that? The latest outcomes of that is reflected in the first bullet here. Believe it or not, 20% of the world's artificial intelligence chip designers are actually in India, the world's chip designers. So we might be designing the chips, but we're designing it for the global companies. So chip manufacturing has only just beginning to take off, quite unlike in China. The fact of the matter is, however, that the designs are still being, a significant proportion of the design engineers are in India. One good outcome of the fact that we had this significant software power or human capital base has been, one, the development, 1,700 international companies coming and setting up global capability centers. So India is not just generating software for global companies, but actually providing a whole variety of services, which is, which are being provided by these global capability centers. But they are all being done for the foreign firms. In addition, one good thing that has come about, which has very significant implications for inclusiveness, is the emergence of a digital public infrastructure. So our digital public infrastructure is sort of comparable to that what you will find in Russia or in China or elsewhere. Okay, moving on. Let me turn quickly to the 5 pillars of the skills ecosystem. The first pillar, of course, is the age-old government-inspired and government-funded industrial training institutes. These have existed since the 1950s. They were created to supply the shop floor workers for the import substituting industrialization that was taking off. Now, these are both in the public and the private sector. They provide 1 to 3 years duration training, and their numbers have grown very dramatically, about which we'll show a graph later on. They've grown, they didn't grow very much for about 50 years until the first decade of this century. However, between 2007 and now, the number of private ITIs in particular, which obviously cater to the industrial sector mainly, but also to the services sector, has shot up to a total of about 14 to 15,000. From under 4,000 about 15, 20 years ago, it's shot up. The second, and the rest of the institutions are also relatively, compared to the ITIs, much more recent. We have the NSDC, the National Skill Development Corporation, was created in 2011, which is government inspired and tends to be government funded, but it's actually private vocational training providers are given about 75% of funding for creating a center for providing short-term training. So that's the second pillar. The third pillar, of course, is the secondary school system, the government secondary and higher secondary school system. We got, for the first time in 2014, which is literally 11 years ago, serious vocational education being introduced, but not as a stream. It was only as an option, as one optional course being offered to general academic students. So we now have about 20,000 schools in the country out of the 120,000 schools, secondary schools that exist in the country, which are offering vocational education, which are based on the National Vocational or Skills Qualification Framework. And so these are, of course, also relatively short term. Then, of course, you have the enterprise-based training. That's the fourth pillar. And this takes two forms. One is the private corporates, the independent private corporates, a subject I'll come back to. But the tragedy is that only a third or so of all registered private corporates actually undertake enterprise-based in-firm training, which is much lower than what you would find in any of the other BRICS. It tends to be upwards of 50% in the other BRICS, and in China it tends to be about 85%. And the final pillar is called the apprenticeship system. Now, this apprenticeship system is run by the Ministry of Skill Development as well as by the Ministry of Education. This is under an act called the National Apprenticeship Act of 1961. So the apprenticeships have been available in largely the large companies, but unfortunately we have far too few companies willing to offer apprenticeship, which is, of course, one of the banes of our TVET system, which is a tragedy, because obviously apprenticeship enables these youngsters who've just come out of the school system to acquire some on-the-job experience. Moving on. So till date, we still have a situation where we still have only 500,000 apprentices in a workforce of over 600 million. So the journey of the apprenticeship system unfortunately tells a rather sorry tale. And the good news is that the numbers have grown to 500,000. 10 years ago, when I did a detailed study for the Planning Commission about apprentices and about the ITIs, there were only 250,000 formal apprentices in our companies. That number has at least gone up to 500,000. However, the conditions under which they can be hired, they've been eased, things have improved, so the numbers are increasing. So the upshot of all of this is, because we, of course, have a very large informal sector, the vast majority of our young get informal apprenticeships in informal enterprises. So you've got most of the enterprise are dominated by the informal sector, and their apprenticeships are also informal. The implication is there is no certification. Unlike in the government-sponsored apprenticeship that I've just been talking about under the Apprenticeship Act of 1961, where you get certified, you get no certification, which is what, underlines the importance of RPL, or the recognition of prior learning, in our highly informalized economy, a subject that I will revisit in a subject on which I've recently done a brief paper. Moving on. Okay, there is a national skills policy. I'm not going to speak about it in the interest of time, so that I can sort of very quickly now hand the floor over to Pradeep. But before I do that, let me just discuss briefly the quality issues and formal TVET that result in, that actually are still undermining the system, and which are leading to poor employability, and the workers ending up in, despite receiving formal VET, ending up in informal work. And the most serious problem, in my view, is that it is a supply-driven, government-driven system, which is government-financed, when we all know from international evidence that what works is a demand-driven, employer-managed and financed TVET system. And unfortunately, that's not what we have. Secondly, in these four or five pillars, we have serious instructor shortages. The instructors themselves may not have industry experience, which is itself very problematic. Thirdly, I just was talking about the growth in the formal apprentices. The registered apprenticeship system, however, is a standalone system. What do I mean by that? It's not part of the pre-employment training program. In other words, I'm saying that if you join an ITI and then later on you become an apprentice, the ITI certification will come in any case, and then you become an apprentice, and that apprenticeship certification will be a separate thing. In other words, there's no on-the-job apprenticeship requirement as part of TVET. It's in that sense standalone. And I find that very problematic, and therefore it violates the principle even of the Germanic system, where it's not part of the overall system, where employability is being ensured through on-the-job training as well. Fourthly, we have RPL, which has been going on for some 7 or 8 years. It's of recent vintage, but again, it's of poor quality. So that's why I'm saying in this last bullet, in all of these areas, India should be interested in learning from the BRICS. Moving on, I mean, the result of all this is that in this, for instance, a short-term training that is done by vocational training providers who are funded by the NSDC, you can see, look at this. Most of them, of course, end up in the services. About a quarter here show up in manufacturing. But look at this, the size structure of enterprises where they end up working. 60% of them end up who have graduated from short-term training. Okay, they work in enterprises which employ less than 10 workers. What does that mean? The vast majority of these are informal enterprises. So only about 40% of them are working in formal enterprises, even after receiving formal VET. That's a real problem. Okay. In other words, short-term training is not quite doing it for these youngsters to enable them to get a formal sector job, which is, of course, what their aspiration is. Now, I won't spend time on this. What are the global TVET models, and why the problem with our system? I'll go directly to the problem of our formal private sector being dominated by free riders. In other words, they are not doing enterprise-based training, as I mentioned in a previous slide, and at the same time, they're not willing to sort of shell out any funds for this. And yet, at the same time, the system has become government funded, government managed. The result is, poor employability outcomes, and the kids are still entering the informal sector. Um, what we've sort of what we've developed are sector skill councils, which bring together private employers. But what we don't have is what I would recommend, which is a sectoral levy-based financing. Moving on, I think I'm going to sort of at this point hand over to Pradeep so that he can take over and take us to the end. Yeah, Pradeep.
Thank you. So yeah, hope I'm audible. And yeah, so in the interest of time, may I request Professor Mehrotra to move the slide when I say just next
Yeah,
one?
of course.
Thank you for that.
Standing by.
Otherwise, I need to share again. So thank you for that.
No, standing by.
Thank you. So good morning, good evening, based on the place that you are, because this is a global audience. And I am also equally happy to be part of the CERE network, which is being formed to discuss education issues in the BRICS countries. So this is an emerging global issue that we all are talking about. Thank you for that. I have also got a couple of chances to visit HSC University, which is a fantastic place for learning, and also the city I enjoyed a lot with my family. So that's a great thing that I did. Let me get back. The first point I must mention is it's very difficult to talk after Professor Mehrotra on TVET, because he is the one who has nurtured a lot on this issue, not necessarily in India. He has made comparative issues with China, comparative studies with China, and many other. So I am a student of him, and I have learned a lot from his writings, his books and all. So I'm thankful for generating so much of knowledge on this. Let me get back. I think this is the idea that Professor Mehrotra very clearly mentioned in some of his writings is about the demographic dividend. So we have lots of young people now in India. So this is the share that is being given here. In 2036, we will have a very large share of people who will be between 15 to 59 or even 15 to 29 also, that will be going off. So what I'm trying to say, an attempt both in the, particularly in the policy domain, it is being said that unless we use this potential youth, I would say potential youth, it's becoming difficult for the Indian economy to grow. Even in many occasions, ILO, IMF, and there are several UN organizations, developmental organizations, they have clearly spelled out this, that we should use youth. But the irony is that in which direction we are using the youth. Let's say we are targeting to bring the vocational education with them, like giving vocational training, TVET training to them. As a result, they will be meaningfully employed in the labor market. That's an important human capital. I think in the basic, the fundamental of human capital theory tells that if you train them, so they will be meaningfully engaged in the labor market and they will contribute to the economy and society. Just before that, I think I will come to this point about ITIs, but anyway, as you have come, so let you just go ahead. Yeah. So what has happened over time, as Professor Mehrotra was mentioning, the market has expanded a lot for this TVET sector. I think this number was already being mentioned. We have huge number of ITIs. It's not IITs. Please make a difference between IITs and ITIs, because IITs are in Indian Institute of Technology who produce engineering graduates, which are mostly not in India, but they go to Silicon Valley and others, as Professor Mehrotra mentioned in his talk. But these are the places where ITIs, Industrial Training Institutes, sometimes also we have polytechnics, who produce these TVET graduates mostly. And largely, what is happening in this? We are producing a lot ITI or TVET graduates, but the situation goes like this. I have got some sense from my understanding that in the over time, when we are producing these TVET graduates and they are not being meaningfully employed in the labor market, we are finding a human capital crisis. And that human capital crisis I see in two terms. One is we are actually getting into a crisis in trust in TVET sector. Because the trust that we had in TVET sector, that is actually we are losing, and there is a clear crisis in that sector. And what is that crisis? I am not calling in that sense, but whatever I read, I coined that term as crisis in trust. And this crisis in trust with TVET sector is rapidly happening. It's largely because these TVET graduates are getting unemployed, or even if they are getting employment, they are underemployed. That means they are not getting a job that actually they are supposed to get. So that is happening in all other graduates, but that is also happening to a larger scale among TVET graduates. And this trust is actually leading towards a lot, I would say, large wastage of human capital. Because we are producing lots of TVET graduates or vocational graduates, and they are not meaningfully employed, or even they are unemployed. Majority of them are also unemployed, and that is actually creating a crisis in the entire human capital story in Indian context. That's the point number one that I see. So what are we getting out of this? We have youth who are potential, who are supposed to be employed in the labor market. And one mechanism that we see to employ them in the labor market is through TVET sector. But there is a disjoint, or I would say there is a disconnection, or there is a loose connection between the degree they are getting and the kind of job they are getting, or even they are not getting jobs. I'm not getting into the idea of skill mismatch, which is an area that often we talk about, given the interest of the time. So I'm just telling that the trust crisis that is happening in the TVET sector, and it's an important concern for many of us. Let me tell you that this. With that, we can see very clearly these ITIs are being produced, like ITIs are being set up, and they are producing huge number of graduates. If you can see, they are largely in the private sector. There are lots of private ITIs that are coming up, and in most cases, some of the writings they are saying very clearly, these are not actually institutes, they are shops. I would say degree selling mills. So they are selling degrees without actually earning a degree. So graduates are, in some cases, it is happening in this way, like they are not attending any class, but still they are getting degrees. That's the kind of situation that has emerged. Let me summarize how it is actually, what is leading to this. The thing, like the idea moves in this way. The idea is then whether at any point, are we measuring the productivity of TVET sector from the supply side, let's say. If we are generating thousands of ITI, like this TVET colleges or even institutes, what are they doing? What are they producing? So I want to get into the idea of productivity. So in the productivity of TVET sector is, I don't think there is any study in that sense which clearly tells what is the productivity of this TVET sector. So at one side, I just said about the trust crisis with them. The second time, and in the second point, I'm trying to say we are not able to measure the productivity of this TVET sector. So there is a dual crisis, I would say, the productivity crisis and also the trust crisis. And that is actually leading to a large crisis, I would say large trust and productivity crisis in the TVET sector, which is serious. And this is what is I would say the time is gone anyway. But still, if you have little time, we must think about this very, very carefully. Let me tell this ASER report 2022, which tells about the rural youth participation in the TVET sector. So, for example, if you see the first column, in fact, the second column, percentage of youth taking vocational training or other such courses, you will not find many according to their study level, let's say standard 10 or below, then standard 11 to 12 and all that. Mostly the graduate, undergraduate and other, they are the one who are taking these vocational courses. But you see the other columns also. Largely, the students who are taking such vocational courses, they are with 3 months or less. That means what is happening? There are some organizations or institutes that are coming in this TVET sector, which are selling short-term courses. You can enroll today, and in 3 months, you will getting a certificate, which may or may not be useful in the labor market. So in this context, I must mention that there is a clear information asymmetry in the TVET sector. That means what actually these TVET organizations are doing or the institutes are selling, and what is actually needed or aspired by the graduates, or let's say the youth, Indian youth, there is a strong mismatch, and that is actually leading to a larger crisis that I was talking about. This is the second point I'm getting into. This was my first conceptual, or I would say how I look at this problem. Second one is this. Mostly, if you see the policy domain in Indian context, particularly in the TVET sector, an important objective of this is to engage this youth in the self-employment activities. Let me underline self-employment activities, because the idea that is being, or the slogan, both at the policy level and also at the academia level, that you should not be a job seeker, you should be a job creator. So the transformation from job seeker to job creator is an issue that is going on, and how that is being conceptualized, or how that is being done, that is being done largely through this TVET sector. That's the objective I'm saying. So what is the job of an important job that is being highlighted in the policy domain is to give this Indian youth the what we call this TVET education, and they will not be a job seeker, rather they will be job creators, because they will open their own self-employment opportunities. But what is the statistics that says about the self-employment activities? Because I wrote an article which is published in JVET, Journal of Vocational Education and Training, where we analyze the self-employment opportunities in the non-farm sector. Because if you see the self-employment activities in Indian context, they are largely in the agriculture domain. So when we examine the self-employment activities in the non-farm sector, we found very few people are engaged in the self-employment activities in non-farm sector. And again, they are not exactly giving some opportunities for others, or they are not actually, you can't say that they are job creators, they are just self-employed. So that self-employment domain, which we talk a lot in the Indian context, is something even today is a black box, I would say. And that is that actually, I must say that that needs to be unfolded, unpacked in the Indian context. If you see this figure, there are three kinds of jobs, not this, regular, casual, and self-employed. If you see, this is being estimated from the NSSO data, and it says average monthly earnings for different kind of groups who are engaged in regular jobs, who are engaged in casual, and the self-employed. In self-employed, you will see their monthly earning is significantly less than regular jobs. It is 7,000 INR in comparison to, let's say, 12,000 INR in regular jobs. And it's almost true between the last 10 years, to 2012 to 2022. So that actually demotivates a lot to the self-employment people who are actually engaged in the self-employment activities, the youth who are engaged in the self-employment activities. And this needs to be seen very, very carefully in this context. What I did in that paper, if you see, we also estimated the predicted probability of getting into self-employment activities with different education levels. So if you see the x-axis, you have different education levels, and in the y-axis, we have probabilities of self-employment, whether you are getting into the self-employment activities or not. Very interestingly, with the increase in the level of education, once you go from illiterate to primary, below primary to primary, upper primary, and so on and so forth, your probability of getting into self-employment activities declines. So higher your education level, your probability that you will be engaged as a self-employment in the self-employment sector, it declines. And the other interesting fact from this figure you will find with different age groups. So we often say that Indian youth may be likely to get into self-employment activities. That's the kind of policy discussion that we have. But if you see this data, this clearly tells the people who are in the age group of 18 to 35, in the blue line, which is at the bottom. That means these are the group people who are least likely to get into self-employment activities with the increase in their level of education. That means they're again looking for regular jobs. We can call them as job seekers. That is clearly visible in the Indian job sector. And you will see now, I'm not getting into many advertisements, but a few recent government jobs where you will have, like, the jobs are for, let's say, 8th grade people, like the people who are passed, let's say, grade 10 in the school level. But the students or the candidates who are applying for such jobs are from engineering, let's say BTech completed, MBA, even some PhD holders, they are also applying for such jobs. So there is a clear tendency of job seekers, and that is clearly visible in the Indian job market. And it's very, very clear in many writings also, it's being clear. Yeah.
Pradeep, shall we bring in this?
Yeah, now we'll get into summary and policy implications, but let me summarize in 1 minute what I'm trying to say. The point that I'm trying to raise is there is a trust crisis with the institution. in TVET sector, it's very, very clear. And that I call as a human capital crisis. And that needs to be very, very clearly understood. And one way of looking at it, as I have proposed it, is measuring their productivity. That what is they are doing in the market? Are they actually fooling the youth, or they are actually creating knowledge base in that context? And that's a broader question that I want to bring in. Thank you again for the opportunity. Yeah, I hand over to Professor Meher.
Yeah, so this is my last slide, and we'll close after this very quickly, just to summarize what what is the broad argument that we are making and what are the policy implications. First of all, I think we've demonstrated that the foundational skills of our workforce still remain relatively weak, and so there is urgent needs still for adult literacy program for our farmers, because unfortunately what we've seen in the last 4 years, thanks to the policy mistakes of the current government, some 80 million workers have been added to agriculture. The opposite should be happening in a fast-growing economy where non-farm jobs should be growing, but the opposite has been happening with manufacturing jobs falling and so on. So what we need is adult literacy programs for farmers, because the yields of our farmers are actually way below international levels. It also implies that with a large workforce in the informal sector, recognition of prior learning has to become standard practice, and it should be quality RPL. The second problem I think we identified was that the 5 pillars of formal TVET, they tend to be government driven, except of course the enterprise-based training that's carried out in the large firms, which remains relatively limited. Tragedy remains that, otherwise, other than these formal TVET institutions, most workers acquire skills on the job, but they do it informally in the unorganized sector, in unregistered firms, and which is the reason why RPL, the importance of RPL rises. We also said the quality of the training in the formal TVET in the 5 pillars remains, leaves much to be desired. Fourthly, I think we are saying that industry engagement is absolutely critical, but the current level of industry engagement through the sector skills councils is still very weak. We adopted the Anglo-Saxon model, which is a poor substitute for the Germanic model. I'm not saying that the Germanic model can be adopted in India, but at least the principle of dualism can certainly be adopted, that kids who are undergoing TVET of whatever form are required to undertake internships and apprenticeship as part of their certification. So finally, if I was still a policymaker, which I was, unlike what Pradeep gave you to understand, I was very much a skills-related policymaker for about 8 or 10 years when I was in the government in the Planning Commission. What I would do today is that I would advise the government that we need to divert attention away from higher education, because the government is now keen on taking our 27% GER in higher education all the way to 50% by 2035. Unfortunately, what has happened on account of the very rapid massification of higher education in the last 15 to 20 years is that quality in our higher education institutions and privatization has grown very rapidly, and hence employability has fallen very sharply. But it simultaneously, the new education policy of the government of India has decided that we not only have to take higher education enrollment to 50% from 27, but we have to take gross enrollment for TVET to 50%. We are currently in the formal institutions barely at at 5% of the workforce is in formal TVET. So enrollment is still extremely low. It's no more than 10 or 11% of the total relevant age cohort. Taking it to 50% is overambitious, but it's certainly a goal worth pursuing for the following reason, that sending them into higher education to learn practically nothing and come up and essentially bide their time before they enter the labor market and find themselves unemployable, as I showed earlier in the youth unemployment rates. It's much more useful for them to be diverted away in grades after grade 10, because we've universalized grade, secondary education. We are rapidly moving towards universalizing higher secondary as well. It's much more important to move these youngsters who are still doing general academic secondary into TVET. That means funding for the TVET system has to increase. But simultaneously, funding for formal enterprises to do TVET and within firms has to increase, which is why I'm so hung up on creating the levy-based system in India. Why is all this important? Last sentence. It's important because our demographic dividend is running out by 2040. We've estimated this in a forthcoming book called India Out of Work. For all the 4 other remaining BRICS, the demographic dividend is gone. For China, it went between 2012 and 2015. For Brazil and South Africa, it went by about 2018 to 2020. More recently, for Russia, Russia's been an aging society for the longest time. So what does this mean? If we want to realize the benefits of the demographic dividend, and we do not invest in TVET and in education generally and in STEM in higher education, we run the risk of running out of our demographic dividend. Thank you very much for your attention.